We're going to pick up here with some strategies with regard to revenue generation and cost reduction. Uh, Before we can consider raising the price, we have to make sure that we have not priced ourselves out of the market. In other words, are the enhancements that we are making worth customers paying a little bit more for? Now, after in the last video, I think I talked about sponges and having the same sponge that my mother used. And I happened to be washing the dishes in my sink from lunch here and discovered that I had perhaps fibbed ever so slightly to you. The sponge which my mother had on our kitchen counter my entire childhood was square. Now, although this is somewhat disgusting, this is not a square sponge. And this is, I guess, theoretically designed to fit to the shape of my hand so that perhaps, although I probably have less scrubbing surface, I may be able to more efficiently scrub. And, you know, they got me with the marketing. It looked it looked familiar, but, you know, something that might be an upgrade enough that I was willing to buy it and have therefore now sort of adopted this shape of sponge. And that's what I buy, and that's now, although again, same company, same sort of general design, the shape of it was just enough to sort of suck me in. We can also look at cost reduction. This can certainly start at the manufacturing stage. And, you know, this is where companies sort of struggle with, do I manufacture in the US? Do I manufacture abroad? Certainly pros and cons to each. Generally, manufacturing in the US is more costly, although as we saw during the pandemic, where shipments to the US were being halted and really the borders had kind of closed off to a lot of things, getting things into the US can be a problem, and you certainly don't want your supply chain disrupted because you can't get your product. You may also not have really access to what's going on if you're manufacturing your product in a foreign country, although you may be able to do it more efficiently. And cheaply and more efficiently means nothing, though, if you lose control over your production and you can't get your product. So again, pros and cons to consider, but making sure that whatever you choose or mix of choices, that it's enough to make sure that the product is sustainable and, as your slide says, encourages good life cycle planning. We need to be familiar with the concept called target cost. In other words, where do we have to price our product in order for us to capture the percentage of market share that we need? If we price ourselves too cheaply and we cut our margins down, then we may have difficulty affording enough inventory to keep on hand, for example. So it's particularly important that any target costing is done in a coordinated effort with our suppliers, perhaps ordering in bulk or having, you know, predetermined frequencies so that we can get the best pricing deal through our suppliers, and then that will hopefully help us not have to trim our margins while we achieve the target cost that we need to capture our market share. And again, this is just a flow chart which basically talks about that process and whether or not, you know, you've met your target, and if not, you kind of go back into the product and design phase. Do you renegotiate? Do you use less expensive parts or parts that maybe are sourced locally and perhaps more easily acquired? And then once you have met your target, then you know that you've got a sustainable product line. So the just-in-time manufacturing is something that we saw really, it was really the innovative way to manage supply chains. And the pandemic absolutely turned that on its ear when we saw stockouts of really staple type items, bleach, toilet paper, paper towels, chicken. Um, Suddenly everybody was worried they wouldn't be able to, make chicken salad sandwiches. I don't know. But the just-in-time manufacturing system assumes that basically we are pulling supplies in, or we are pulling product in at predetermined times based on a need cycle. And we want to have as little sitting around in, dead inventory, or I don't want to say dead, but non-moving inventory as possible. What the basis behind this is that shelf space is expensive. And the more shelf space you take up with stuff that's not moving quickly, the more that you shrink your margins. Although if you have no product because you have really limited your ordering to only what you've needed, now you've got a supply chain disruption. No product to sell means no margin. So making sure that there is at least a balance, and we're now seeing some stockpiling in the industry where that practice had completely fallen out of favor because of the just-in-time model. And ideally you will have long-term contracts, but I think that, again, what we saw in terms of the run on shopping and supply chain shortages in terms of the ability to get raw materials from overseas has kind of turned a lot of this on its ears. So I don't want to say take it for a grain of salt, but I think that being a purist from a just-in-time standpoint is not necessarily good business right now, and maybe perhaps in the future. Um, and again, the premise being that we've got really strong linkages between our suppliers, and when our stock reaches a certain low point, that the reorder is done automatically, and there is we are down to a well-oiled machine where we know if we reorder at this point, by the time we've sold our last item, the new items are about ready to be loaded onto the shelves, so that we've got a good balance of no stock out, but by the same token, we don't have too much on hand. There are certain concepts of just-in-time that we certainly don't want to let go of, regardless of what happens in our economy. Having workers that are multi-skilled is particularly important. The ability to shift workers from one area to another, as opposed to having workers that are so specially trained that if they're out of product, and in this particular department, those workers are now sitting idle, which is really not a good situation. So organizing your manufacturing so that you've got basically entire products being produced from one cell, as opposed to you're producing this product in this cell, and then it moves on for the next value added part and on down the line. You've got cells that are producing from soup to nuts the entire production of an item. And again, that will require your workers to be able to work on different phases of the same product, as opposed to maybe an auto manufacturer that has people just putting tires on cars, and those people get really good at putting tires on cars. But that is more the traditional model, as opposed to, again, having everything that is all done within a single cell, as opposed to handing off down the line in a traditional manufacturing environment. Now, despite the sort of self-contained nature of these cells, you want to have kind of a centralized hub where each cell can very efficiently pull resources that it needs for its production. Again, because of the cross-training nature, it's also very easy to take excess workers from one cell and move them over to another if needed, because all the workers are cross-trained. Another important concept behind the just-in-time manufacturing is that there is basically no tolerance for defects. Rather than the what's considered sort of the acceptable quality level in the traditional system, which means we have a tolerance for a certain number of bad products before we stop and kind of retool our system. On the other hand, the just-in-time, any worker on the line that spots a defective product has the ability to halt production in that moment, and everyone looks at the defect, figures out what the problem is, and then corrects it, production resumes. So there is basically a zero tolerance for defects with the just-in-time, as opposed to the traditional method, which is willing to assume that a certain amount of what goes out the door isn't going to work the way it should, which is not a great philosophy. These next couple of slides are the comparison between the just-in-time and the traditional approaches, and I'm again not going to read all of these to you, but you can pause these slides and review those charts. Costing from a just-in-time manufacturing process is often more accurate because we are converting many of our costs to what is directly attributable to the individual products. We've got batch levels being converted to unit levels of production. And in a job order system, we're going to have certain sort of I guess repetitive types of orders that come in versus special order types of products. And so we're going to separate our costs out in the jobs that are kind of follow our traditional process, because we want to make sure that the special order jobs are charged appropriately. They shouldn't be charged the same rate as our traditional product line, when we may have added services or setups or something that are necessary for the custom orders. In terms of backflush costing, or I guess in terms of costing, the just-in-time system has kind of predetermined points that they call trigger points that we're going to use in the way that we assign costs. Now, here are 4 different variations. Because we don't have a stockpile of raw materials inventory, for example, anything that we purchase in terms of raw materials goes straight into the work in process inventory. So the purchase of raw materials would be the trigger point for items to be put into work in process inventory, and so on. Now, we may also just have completion of goods or the sale of goods as the trigger point for calculating product costs. And that concludes Chapter 11.